Hello and welcome back to the Skeptic Fox channel. So this year we've had to deal with an awful lot. Biased news reporting, fake misleading news, Islamic terrorism, Bearing getting involved in that car accident and needing reconstructive surgery, and a Kasparian being better than us. And to be honest, I could deal with that, I genuinely could. One thing I can't handle though is ideologues attacking our favourite TV shows. So like the good little fanboy I am, I'm here today to defend Game of Thrones.
I wanted to talk about Game of Thrones. I don't know if I've ever talked about Game of Thrones on this channel, which is weird because I minored in communications and I used to study English Lit. So talking about media and analyzing it critically is kind of my jam. I know I'm gonna get a lot of YouTube trolls telling me that it doesn't matter, it's just a show, blah 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 blah.
So are you saying that anyone that disagrees with you, in this case you think something's an issue and the other person doesn't, then they are automatically a troll? That's rather arrogant of you, don't you think?
But I think it would be foolish to think that the media that we consume, especially media as popular as Game of Thrones, where a large segment of the population is internalizing it and consuming it, I think it would be foolish to say that it doesn't affect us in some way.
Well, maybe most people feel that they're not so easily influenced by fictional TV because we're fucking adults. It could just be to do with me not being part of an ideology with a hive mind attitude. But I like to think for myself. Maybe you should give it a go, and then maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't see everything in the world as problematic.
Popular media not only reflects current social values, but it also perpetuates them. Not only does it mirror society's norms and values, but it confirms them. It repeats them back to us, and it validates the things that we already believe to be true.
So let me get this straight. A TV show which has dragons, ice zombies, and gigantic wolves reflects our reality. Are you fucking kidding me?
If you're someone that doesn't believe that media affects us, then I urge you to do a little more research and check out the tons of studies confirming that, yes, media has an effect on us. 99% of my communications minor was just reading various theories and studies done that basically just say, yep, media affects us, like we've been thinking all along.
But affects who? There is a massive difference between the brain of a child, a teenager, and an adult. Media can also mean anything from news, reality shows, fictional shows that are grounded in reality, and fictional shows that leave reality behind. Game of Thrones is a show for adults that has magic swords for killing ice zombies and people who come back from the dead. That, I doubt, will have anywhere near the same effect as news which we believe to be true. Without any links to the sources that you were referring to, it's hard to comment, but I'm willing to bet that you are being intellectually dishonest in your representation of these studies.
I find that whenever I talk about representation, I get lots of people saying that representation doesn't matter, why are you worrying about this, etc., etc. And I also find that typically, not always, but typically, the people saying things like this are widely represented in society.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
I did a whole video about this subject a while back called Can Emma Stone Play an Asian Character? And I was much more eloquent there, so if you want to check that out for a more detailed discussion on representation, then you definitely should. But what I realized the other day is that there are more major characters in Game of Thrones that have red hair than there are black or Asian characters.
You think a show which backstories is based on the War of the Roses in England, in medieval England, is problematic because it doesn't have enough black people and it has more redheads? You do realise that Westeros is based on Britain. The wall is basically Hadrian's Wall. The Wildings are basically Scottish Celts, who, I don't know if you know this, are more known for having red hair and not being fucking black.
And in case you were wondering, the population of black and Asian people in the entire world is much, much, much larger than the population of redheads.
Westeros isn't based on the whole fucking world. It is based on Britain.
I think redheads are only like 2% of the population, so very insignificant.
2% is an insignificant number. I remember that just in case you decide to do a video on transgender people in TV shows.
Yet somehow they dominate a lot of Game of Thrones, but I've also seen it in a lot of other like fiction. Harry Potter, the Weasleys are an entire family of redheads, which I think is just genetically impossible.
So, in a movie about witches and wizards, the thing you're bringing up for being impossible is the fact that there's an entire family of gingers. Also, Harry Potter is set in England. If Harry Potter was set in Africa, there'd be more black people in it. If Harry Potter was set in Asia, there'd be more Asian people in it. Do you see how that works?
It's a recessive trait, and I don't really give a fuck about the accuracy of redhead representation. I'm more concerned about the lack of representation of people of color in fantasy just in general. And that's not to say that there are zero people of color in fantasy or there's no people of color writing fantasy. I think Ursula Le Guin is a great example of this. I'm not disputing that there aren't important characters of color or authors of color who are making great contributions to the realm of fantasy.
So basically you're complaining that authors don't write the balance of characters that you like. Well, if you're not happy with the balance of characters, write some of your fucking self. Don't try and change other people's own work. What's the difference between a bomb vest and a feminist? The bomb vest actually does something when it's triggered.
And I wouldn't even consider myself a huge fantasy nerd or anything like that. Love Harry Potter. It's my favorite book series of all time. I love Game of Thrones. I've read the first 2 books, but if you're familiar with the Game of Thrones books, they're like 1,000 pages per book. So a little bit hard to like get through all of it. One day when I have more time, I'll definitely do that. But I do think it's possible to critically analyze and talk about the television show separately from the books as its own complete thing. So when I talk about Game of Thrones, I'm specifically talking about the television show. Parts of the books can definitely be relevant to the discussion, especially if they diverge from the HBO series, but this is specifically where I'm coming from in my analysis. So when I did post on social media yesterday about Game of Thrones having more major characters with red hair than there were black people on the entire show, definitely pissed off some nerd boys. Gotta love those nerdy fanboys who feel the need to be gatekeepers against any sort of critique of the things they love.
That's because your comments were fucking stupid and people are tired of feminism trying to fucking ruin everything.
Which I never understood because I think that the things I love are more interesting when you're able to critically analyze them.
Really? Because if I find something great, I like to appreciate the art.
If something is great, then it deserves to be, critiqued in a way that points out the pros and the cons. One of the main arguments I received is that Westeros, which is the main region in Game of Thrones that is explored, but it does occasionally diverge from that, is based on medieval Europe.
And that's pretty much the only line you need to say to show how ridiculous this complaint is.
And something that I was talking about on the old Tumblr the other day, which I think is relevant to this discussion, was the idea of Watsonism versus Doyleism, which I didn't know were terms until the other day, but they're super helpful in having these conversations. The terms originate from Sherlock Holmes, where Watsonian is referring to the fictional narrator, Dr. Watson, and Doyleism is referring to the actual author of the series, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I used to mix up the words Arthur and author when I was a kid, which is a fun little fact about Marina. If you're someone who's taking a Watsonian perspective, then you're only thinking about your argument in terms of the fictional universe that was created. It's basically looking at things from the reality of the fictional work and only being able to explain things based on that reality. There's no outside author or cultural influence because you're only really gonna be thinking of things as if you were someone existing in that universe.
There are 3 flying dragons. If we analyze the TV show from the perspective of our reality, it wouldn't make fucking sense.
Doyleism is the perspective that I personally tend to fall into because I used to major in, English literature, and that's what all of our papers and all of our study was looking at why an author did a certain thing and how they might have been influenced by the culture they were living in and how that affects the narrative. So someone from a Doylist perspective would be making commentary outside of the universe and thinking of the fictional work as a creative object rather than something that just is. So when I talk about representation of Game of Thrones, but just in general, I'm not talking about, well, it only focuses on Europe and that's why there were no black people. I'm thinking of the motivations and the reasons and the potential biases that the author or the show creators might have had that would make them want to only focus on Europe.
1. Because the author of the book was interested in the War of the Roses. 2. Because many great books in the genre, such as Lord of the Rings, is Eurocentric. 3. The developers of the TV show didn't want to change the show from being Eurocentric because that's what the book was, and the book was so popular. Why change a winning formula? I don't understand how this way of looking at things helps your argument.
And to only highlight white characters. It's like when you read a history book in high school and you think, oh, well, we're only learning about Europe and America, so that's where all of the important historical events happen.
From an American perspective, yes, of course, the most important historical events are going to have come from either Europe or America. If you were in India, the historical curriculum would be based more on India. Again, I don't understand how you don't see this. Also, schools only have a certain amount of time they can allocate to teaching history. So they're going to choose what they think is more relevant to the culture they are in. At university level, you don't have that. You can spend all your time looking at history. So you can choose to not look at American history and not look at British history and just look at African history. But schools can't do that. Again, that should be simple to see and understand.
When you're in high school, you have to take world history, and I remember that there was a whole chapter dedicated to World War II, which, not saying that World War II isn't important, but then there was only one chapter dedicated to the whole history of Asia. So I think if you've only been taught history that is incredibly American or Eurocentric, then you're not going to realize all of the history that exists outside of that. And I do wonder if the Eurocentrism in a lot of historical books affected George R.R. Martin's decision to only focus on Europe. But he created this entire vast universe, and he knows the historical background for every area, every character, and he could have just maybe focused a little bit on, people of color, maybe just like a tad.
Here she shows then that she's completely ignorant to one of the most important influences on the TV series, that being the book series. And I hate it when feminists and SJWs talk like this, because this is just another level of thought policing. Oh, you're making something from your own imagination and you didn't think this? How fucking dare you? Go back and change your own creation, because I don't like it.
I feel like people will bend over backwards to defend problematic parts of series just because they love them. And I think that because you love something, you should be able to critique it. You should be able to point out the good and bad, because that's what makes it interesting and that's what makes it worth talking about and studying.
No, we will bend over backwards to defend freedom of creation, expression and thought. And yes, you do. But we also have the freedom to voice our disagreement about there even being an issue.
My question for you guys is, how do you feel about the representation of Game of Thrones if you watch Game of Thrones? If you don't watch Game of Thrones, I don't know why you're watching this video, but my apologies. Also, do you consider yourself more of a Watsonian or a Doylist? Because I find that shit really interesting.
It's absolutely fine and makes perfect sense if you understand the history and the interest of the author, and I don't feel the need to identify with either.